Essentially, what I'm going to try and do today in this short talk is look at the question of sovereignty and its multiple meanings, or the multiple dimensions of sovereignty that were imagined, particularly during the era of decolonization across the global south, I would say, but in particular across Africa. I think this moment of decolonization is a really interesting one, where we see kind of new projects of economic development, new ideas of political sovereignty. And I think what really ties together the emerging conversations that were happening at this time was this very clear awareness around the structural limitations that to development that had been posed by colonial rule, but also an awareness of how the international sphere itself was still very much in some ways colonized, and wasn't necessarily an international sphere that was open or democratic in any way. So through both ideological and material changes, many post-colonial nations tried to resist these colonial structures of global capital well into the decolonization era, so well after kind of formal independence had taken place. And through processes like nationalization, industrialization, which was just talked about a lot, states were essentially, I would argue, trying to create new forms of independent economic development that were very much reliant on new forms of cooperation that were regional and transnational, and that also produced really interesting welfare policies like around education, healthcare, employment, and so on. And of course, as we know, many of these projects were very much tied to the nation and to kind of creating a national space that could challenge imperial rule. So today I'm going to start by talking a little bit about these different understandings of sovereignty, and then I'm going to give kind of a more detailed example from Egypt, which is the context that most of my research has focused on. So sovereignty during the anti-colonial and post-colonial period, I would say, was really closely connected to Africa's relationship with the international sphere. And for many thinkers and activists and politicians at that time, they understood this international sphere to be one that was still structured by colonialism. This becomes clearer when we look at initiatives like the Afro-Asian Conference at Bandung in 1955, which brought together leaders of newly independent nations and that aimed to plan for a political and economic future determined by post-colonial nations themselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic development plans and some of the ideas that came out of that conference in relation to economic sovereignty, and also how for many of these figures, sovereignty did not refer simply to kind of formal or legal mechanisms of rule. So I think often, especially in sort of spheres like international law, sovereignty has come to refer much more to a legal status, or a status that is formalized through kind of treaties and so on. But for many of the people active during this era, sovereignty was a much more expansive idea. It was an idea that was legal. Of course, the legal dimension was very important to decolonization, but it was also a question of economic and political independence and economic control over sovereign territory. So in thinking about some of these questions, I found Viviane Jabri's concept of the colonial international really useful. And she uses this term to describe an international sphere that was still permeated by imperialism. So looking at the 1950s and 1960s, during which appearances suggest an end to colonial rule and therefore perhaps an international sphere that's open to all independent or newly independent nations, what we actually see is the continuing presence of colonial power. And we see this in many different ways. And I think this concept of the colonial international, or this attention to how the international sphere was still colonial, is something that we also see in the work of Kwame Nkrumah, so his concept of neocolonialism. We also see it in Adom Getachu's new book, World Making After Empire. So it's certainly something that a lot of people have thought about. What is the connection between national sovereignty and the international sphere at this moment of decolonization? And Jabri argued that the changes that were put forward by post-colonial leaders across Africa and Asia should be understood as attempts to transform this colonial international. So sovereignty at that time, if we remember, was defined as belonging to some nations and not others. And especially under colonial rule, we had all these categories like mandates, protectorates, full colonies, settler colonies, all of these different articulations of sovereignty. But what they all shared was an understanding of the world where European nation states were kind of fully sovereign, and all other nation states were on this path or on the road towards sovereignty, but never actually quite sovereign. And Anthony Anghie has written a really great book about this, and he says, quote, "Sovereignty existed in a linear continuum based on its approximation to the ideal of the European nation state," end quote. So Jabri argues that for many post-independence countries, regaining control over the institutions of international political economy, which they saw as the institutions that were reproducing forms of inequality, was seen as the path to independence. And she says, quote, "In its role in both accumulation and the establishment of legitimacy, the post-colonial state is an interventionist state. It seeks to construct a hegemonic structure that legitimizes a political economy of development, and it builds a state apparatus that is geared for planning and for the management of national resources," end quote. So for her, it's through this attempt to kind of control or gain control over international political economy, and particularly over land and resources, that we see this expansive notion of sovereignty come up. This call for sovereignty was not just a call for legal recognition, but was very much a call for the power of post-independent states themselves to articulate their own programs of independent development. And so if we look at the space of Bandung, for example, we see that sovereignty comes up almost always in relation to some form of economic intervention. Industrialization is one of these, and this comes up quite a lot. This need for industrialization. And other themes that we see come up quite a lot from the communiques that came out of this conference include the need for cooperation within the Global South, the creation and sharing of technical expertise, research and development, the establishment of international bodies to coordinate economic development, and also the right to self-determination in terms of economic policy. And Partha Chatterjee, for example, has said, the communique that came out of this conference suggests that most countries there saw themselves as exporters of raw commodities and importers of industrial products. So I think it's this point about the understanding of colonial capitalism as something that created Global South countries as basically sources of raw commodities that would then be manufactured elsewhere, was very much tied to why industrialization became one of the core kind of demands of this post-colonial moment. And if we look across many parts of the Global South at this time, industrialization and the need to develop industry was very much kind of at the forefront of what decolonization meant. So state-led economic development through industrialization, but also through things like nationalization and so on, was kind of seen as a means of interrupting the dependency that many post-colonial countries still faced, were still facing in relation to global capital. And so a national program for development that emerged from spaces like Bandung is very much tied to, I think, many of the conversations that have been happening in our working group in relation to kind of sovereignty and particularly. So just to kind of wrap up this part about sovereignty, I think this shows us that there were multiple competing ideas of what sovereignty meant at that particular moment. I think there were liberal notions that sovereignty is something that we can see as a form of legal recognition or as something that European nation states had attained while the rest of the world was kind of on the path to attaining. But we also see a much more radical notion of sovereignty coming out of these post-colonial spaces that saw sovereignty as economic, as political, as international, and as I would say very much connected to the question of resources, natural resources, dependency on natural resources, but also this idea of raw commodities and how these were being manufactured elsewhere. So now I'm going to turn to the context of Egypt and to kind of talk a little bit and give some more detailed examples of how these different, how sovereignty and post-colonial sovereignty kind of evolved. I think Egypt, like many parts of Africa, was drawn into the web of global capital at this moment of colonization, when we see, as in many other places, cotton and other agricultural products kind of become this primary export commodity. So in the context of Egypt, scholars like Timothy Mitchell have written a lot about how this process happened and how it was that cotton in particular came to be such a central part of the Egyptian economy. And he says that he kind of traces this to the initial moment in 1830, when actually many Egyptians were confined to their villages in order to actually produce for this expanding cotton market. A lot of new regulations were introduced, such as Egyptians had to now seek permission or official documents to leave their home villages. They had to show that they were using their land productively and efficiently. They had to ensure that they were meeting certain quotas for cotton that would, and this cotton, of course, was being exported elsewhere. And of course, as Mitchell shows, a lot of violence was embedded in this process of turning much of the land into kind of productive land, not in the sense of producing food or other resources that people needed, but precisely in producing commodities that were seen as especially valuable in the global market. And so here we can kind of start to see the coming together of ideas of productivity, of using the land for private property, but also actually ideas of private property start to emerge at this moment. Many people were drawn into the institution of debt and became indebted in order to kind of survive in this new organization of the economy. And also because there was a lot of resistance to this and a lot of resistance to, for example, the transformation into wage labor and so on, there was also huge amounts of social violence and political violence that came about at this moment in order to discipline people into working in these particular ways to produce these raw commodities at a really huge scale. So, and I'm going to end this part about kind of colonial capitalism by quoting an Egyptian journalist, Al-Nadim, who asked this question to his readers right before kind of the 1952 revolution. He asks, what can the people do now that all the goods are imported? Cooked, canned meat, dried milk, tailored garments, even cotton and wool textiles used to make turbans and kaftans are manufactured and imported from Europe. What are we supposed to do about this calamity? End quote. So we see again this logic of raw commodities actually coming from Egypt, being exported and actually being manufactured elsewhere before they're imported back into the country. And I think this point also about, as this is happening, these countries are also becoming more and more dependent on food and other kind of crucial foods, everyday materials being imported from abroad. So I want to juxtapose this to the moment of decolonization, where I think with all of its limitations and all of the important critiques of the project that emerges at that moment, we do see a very clear awareness of the need to break this form of dependency, right? So in the 50s and 60s, again, like I kind of was talking about earlier in relation to Bandung, we see industrialization, nationalization, the limiting of foreign capital, a very clear understanding of political economy that tried to put forward independent economic development as a form of sovereignty. And I think this is, again, really important to think about in light of what are some of the lessons that we might learn from that moment. I think it's less necessarily the case that that's a model that would work today, but more to ask actually what have been the different historical alternatives in relation to this question of dependency on global capital that we see in many parts of the world. And just to wrap up now, of course, we know that by the 1970s, Egypt, like many other countries, was facing increasing pressure to turn towards the free market. Egypt was one of the first countries, I think, to sign many of these deals, including the IMF structural adjustment deal. And actually in Egypt today, Adam Haney has done really important work to show how so much of food production in particular, but agriculture has been completely kind of transformed into spaces of foreign direct investment, particularly investment from the Gulf countries, which I think is something we see across many parts of Africa, right? That the Gulf is able to secure its food sovereignty or its food by kind of investing in very problematic ways in other parts of the world. So there's lots of really kind of shocking statistics about this, but in particular, by the 2000s, the Egyptian economy was essentially controlled by 20 to 25 family-owned monopolies, many of which were almost entirely funded by foreign capital. So going to end by thinking a little bit or kind of asking this question of what we might learn from that era and what some of the resistance to things like foreign capital and so on might tell us in this moment where, again, we seem to be very much engulfed in a moment of free trade, foreign direct investment. And even though we often say this is a moment of neoliberal crisis, I think it's also a moment in which we still are seeing this question of what alternatives can we imagine? And is there anything at all that we can learn from the past and from this moment of decolonization where many of these policies were brought into question?